Great. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us for this discussion about what's up with men, motivating men to be allies in the workplace. We are thrilled to be joined with our partners from Blueprint. Blueprint is a Canadian-based NGO. They're based at the University of British Columbia, dedicated to thought leadership about healthy masculinity and about enhancing men's positive contributions to their communities. And also joined by Angela Guy from L'Oreal North America. She's Senior Vice President for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion there. And I should also add, she's a board member of Promundo-US. So we're thrilled to have her in those many roles. And I'll introduce all of our speakers in just a couple of moments. We think this topic needs lots of attention, lots of discussion still. These last few years in the US and many parts of the world around Me Too and Black Lives Matter have led to a necessary and maybe in some ways a historical reckoning on systemic inequalities and social injustices. And at the same time, we know there's a lot to be done to think about what allyship means. What does it mean for men to be part of it, male identified individuals? What does it mean for white men to be part of justice discussions, both around race and around gender equality? And we think this study brings some important insights on it. We're also very mindful of how much these discussions have become polarized in the US and how much a lot of political leaders are using them as attempts to bring votes, whether we watch what's happened in Florida recently and the number of state legislatures that are looking at making it illegal to have certain conversations in schools about sexual diversity, and how many schools and state legislatures have done the same in terms of discussions around racial injustices. So we know these are challenging topics. They're not simply about presenting some data points and we're done. This really is to think deeply about what allyship means, what it requires, and the strategies we need to both counter that polarization and also to bring men to be allies to the process. So with that, I want to set us into a discussion about this new study that Blueprint has carried out. And I want to introduce Dr. John Izzo, who is co-author of this study and is also a co-founder of Blueprint. And I'll let him share more about his background. But John, over to you to tell us about the study, the context of it, the reasons for carrying it out, and a little bit the piece that we're all eager to hear about. So what is up with men? So John, over to you.
Great. So first of all, thank you, Gary and Nikki and Angela. And in a moment, I'll turn it over to Nikki. We'll actually go through some of the major findings of the study. But as Gary said, I'm one of the co-founders of Blueprint at the University of British Columbia. As Gary said, we're partners with Promundo, both really dedicated to, reimagining men and their role in society and masculinity. And over the last year, actually since last summer, we did a major study in the United States of Canada of how the workplace has changed in the last 5 years post Me Too and the Black Lives Matter movements emerging in the consciousness of both the United States and Canada, both a quantitative and qualitative survey. So Nikki, I'm going to turn over my team member, Nicky, who is involved in the study to tell us some of the major things we found.
Yeah, thanks, John. So hi, everyone. I'm thrilled to be here with you. As John mentioned, Nicky Dhaliwal. I'm Director of Engagement with Blueprint. I've been with the organization for just about 3 years now, following over a decade in a variety of roles in academia, both at the University of British Columbia and others. So over the past year, I've been working with John on this study, which he mentioned, we're exploring how leadership has changed. And, over the past 5 years, there has been an increase in social movements that speak to gender and racial equity. And there's been that increase in awareness. So we were really curious, well, what does that look like in the context of workplaces and in particular, how men's attitudes changed on this. So the study was conducted both in Canada and the US, and it included a representative quantitative survey, both of over 1,000 participants in each country. And that included frontline and C-suite leaders. And for deeper inquiry, we then conducted focus groups with C-suite leaders of all genders. And in the context of providing some highlights, I will be speaking in the gender binary, and that's sort of a nature of the sample size. Unfortunately, we did not have enough participants from non-binary or transgender respondents, and so can't reliably speak to their experiences. However, this could be an important opportunity for further research. So I'll just note that as well. So a couple of highlights. I think, first I'll start with the good news. There has been a shift in awareness. All genders noted that, yes, we have seen a change. And so, what does that look like and where has that happened? And I'll start first with allyship. So the good news is that allyship commitment has grown for all groups, and that includes women, racialized groups, and members of the LGBTQIA+ community. And that's true across age, gender, and seniority. It is more pronounced for women, but significant for all genders. And so that's an important distinction. That being said, allyship to the LGBT community is slightly less. And that change is explained by older men rating allyship to this group as sort of a little less than others. So again, this is an important distinction, that there's still work that needs to be done. But let's dive a minute into, how have things changed for men? And I think there's two sides to this. So the first is, how have men's attitudes changed? And the other is, how has the perception of men as leaders and sort of how has their behaviors by others, how others have perceived, how has that changed? So I'll speak to the first. A majority of men say that they are more committed to inclusion and diversity than before. They're more likely to speak up and challenge lack of equity or misogynistic behaviors. Interestingly, they see themselves as less misogynistic than others and sort of further along the curve than other men, which has implications that we'll speak to a little bit later. But speaking about sort of this misogynistic behavior, sadly, one of the things that we did find is that it really, misogynistic behavior has gone more underground. It hasn't really disappeared. It's more overt, but it's still there. And so when we talk about engaging men and others on these topics and how to change that, we'll dive into that a little bit. So the second is, how have perceptions of men changed? So our study shows that male leaders are perceived as slightly more empathic and inclusive than before. And our C-suite focus groups definitely show that these movements have had an impact on male leaders towards inclusion. And the interesting thing here is that men's attitudes are actually like each other's, regardless of age or race, that there were very little differences across these demographics. And so that speaks to this, male way of seeing things that is quite common, and that there's an alignment between men on these issues. So when we talk about efforts to make progress on these issues, we need to think not just about white men, we need to think about all men. And we did expect some differences here, and there were some. For example, Black men have a greater allyship towards women than white men since the rise of these movements. And actually that might be a good segue into, well, how have things changed for women? And what really stood out to me is the change in how women are seen as leaders. Historically, women are seen as less strategic and visionary, and that's changed. Women are more empowered and emboldened to speak up and challenge things. And simultaneously, they're seen as both charismatic, visionary, assertive, and strategic. And that's at the same level as men, while also more empathic and inclusive. And so, that I think speaks to two things here. One is the perception that we're moving away from stereotyping that assertive equals aggressive for women. And the second is this overall understanding of what it means to be a good leader. The playbook has changed. Empathy, inclusion, these are necessary parts that we all need to keep into consideration. And if we parse all the data by age, if we think about how the different age demographics are allies towards more inclusion, we find that all generations agree that millennials and Gen Z are the most engaged and that the baby boomers are least engaged. However, that's a bit of a myth, because when we dove into the data, there really were no differences between attitudes and behavior. So this idea that older generations are behind isn't is not necessarily true in the context of the data that we've gathered. So that's a bit of the good news. There were some caveats, and one of the significant ones to note is that, for example, in the United States, 13% of men feel that the focus on inclusion and diversity of these movements have divided people, that they've made the workplace more toxic. And they feel that they can't really manage the work of marginalized groups. Now, this is a small group, but it's meaningful. The related piece to this is that men are perceived as more cautious and less confident. And that's, you know, I don't think some caution is a bad thing. That makes them consider that, you know, how am I showing up? What am I doing? And I think that's an important feature. But there is a hesitancy and a fear amongst men of saying and doing the wrong thing. They don't really feel welcomed in the conversation, and they feel confused. And, you know, I think the difference between backlash and caution here is important. Backlash is this idea that the movements themselves were negative. I'm less likely to mentor or sponsor than before, whereas cautiousness might be more something like, you know, I feel like I can't hug somebody anymore. I can't compliment men and women. And when taken to the extreme, you know, that leads to disengagement. So, you know, again, so there are some important snapshots here about what's good, where things are now, and I think also some important distinctions about where we need to go. I think the good thing is that majority of men are changing, but they are also saying that we're not there yet, and we have a ways to go.
Thanks for that, Nicky. And I think, you know, yeah, there's both the optimism and the pessimism, or the good news and the bad news there. And maybe I'll just offer a question around that. I mean, we know from survey research in the US that at least research carried out pre-COVID, that if we asked women about experiences of sexual harassment in general, about 1 in 4 women in the US said they had experienced it. When we list specific concrete behaviors, kind of making clear these are sexual harassment, the number goes up to about 40% of women in the workplace. I have not seen whether we've got data of that decreasing. Certainly the workplace has shifted dramatically in the last year since that research came out. But I think it is important to say, you know, a lot of pressure to say, let us see that changes in discourse have actually led to workplaces being safer, more egalitarian, more respectful, more embracing of women's full participation, not to mention other kinds of discrimination. But if we think of sexual harassment as one of the most egregious forms of patriarchal power expressed at the workplace, it does tell us, you know, just how far to go. With that, let me put to the two of you around, you know, what do male leaders need to do differently? And John, maybe you start. To think about really, you know, kind of embodying and accelerating this change. And then Nicky, would love any comments that you have as well on that.
Yeah, and I'm sure Angela may have a view on that as well.
Yeah.
So first, you know, the importance of male leaders in driving greater equity and inclusion can't be understated. I was recently on a panel with for International Women's Day with a group of all female leaders, and I was the one man, and it was really felt privileged to be a part of that. But what struck me was that every one of those female leaders said, we need men, male leaders, to be engaged even more deeply if we're going to make progress. One of the things we do in our work at Blueprint when we work with organizations around diversity and inclusion, we talk about the fact that those at the center of the circle, it's easier to invite people in than it is to bust in from outside or, you know, or away from the center of the circle. So those who have privilege have a special responsibility to create more inclusion. It's just kind of the way it works, right? So I guess 3 things come to mind for male leaders. First, you need to make it clear that this is a priority. And everyone in the study said, and our work backs that up, when male leaders are proactively speaking about their commitment to inclusion and diversity, and those are 2 different things. You know, diversity is who's at the table, inclusion is who experiences a sense of belonging and full participation at the table, and they aren't the same. You know, you can have diversity without inclusion. So second, they said when something happens that is clearly wrong, male leaders need to take decisive action. There can be no equivocation.
Yep.
The third thing is that there's a lot of subtlety to the way you include people in the circle. And I'll just give you one of my favorite examples in one of the focus groups, when a young female leader who was the only female leader on her C-suite and the youngest, said one of the things her male CEO does is he often in meetings when decisions are being discussed will call on her first. And she said, I love, he never says, now let's hear from the millennials or wonder what the women think about this. I just know he does it. So this idea of male leaders creating space, not only of course for women, but any group that might not, normally be in the center of the circle, fully included, I think just being really proactive about taking steps. So I think those three things are, the three things that immediately stand out for me: speaking about it, having decisive action when things are clearly wrong. And the third thing is to be really intentional about bringing people to the center of the circle. And making people aware of that by your actions as much or more than your words.
Yeah, thanks for that.
Gary, can I just add one more thing to what John just said?
Sure, go ahead. Yeah.
I think that one of the most important aspects of that is the awareness, right? The awareness that there is a need to really speak out and show that level of leadership, because the situation has been the situation in the marketplace forever. I mean, men created the laws and rules that we live by today. So for those in a leadership position who've been doing things the way they've been doing them forever can still be successful. We've seen lots of research that says, businesses can be successful in a homogeneous manner, but when they have that level of awareness that there is a need to drive change, change happens. Mm-hmm. So just to complement what John had said, I think making sure that there is at first this level of awareness that there is a need to look at equity, to look at inclusion, is really where the change begins.
Yeah, thanks for that. Nicky, I was going to go back to one of the points that you brought up, which is the fear of speaking out that men were expressing, and kind of related to, I think what John just outlined and Angela as well, around the awareness and about the, signaling it. That is easy to enjoin male leader, it's easy in this panel for us to enjoin men to do that. But I think what your research found, and we've, found some similar findings in some research a few years ago, is men's reluctance to speak out. We're worried of saying the wrong thing, worried as well that, what the male peer group may do. Any thoughts, any reflections you have on that, and anything maybe from the focus groups as well around how to get past that fear to saying, what it takes for men to get over that fear?
Yeah, great point. There's I think maybe a couple of things that I would say to this, and it sort of does build on what John was saying and what Angela's mentioned. And one is, I think there's this need to help men think differently about these issues. And I should note, in the research, there was a greater willingness for male leaders to speak up than frontline. And I think that speaks to how structurally the organizations are designed around these things. But if we think about the point that I just made about helping men think differently about these issues, one of the most well-read books in the world is Think and Grow Rich. And I mean, that what they're doing is teaching people how to think about money. And I just think it's an important mindset shift here, right? If we can be even half as invested in learning how to think about inclusion and being intentional and critical about that, and invite dialogue around that, then I think it creates a different type of space. And related to this is then the need to speak up and challenge. If we want to show up to challenge inclusion or challenge misogynistic behaviors, we need to first understand even how we are showing up. What biases do we have, and unconscious or conscious, and then how are we showing up in relationship to others, and then what contribution are we making to actually change the dialogue around that, and then we can become role models, right? And then really, if we think about role models and as influencers, I mean, one of the highest things that we know in the recent years is the sort of role that influencers play. And if we are showing up differently, then others will be more likely to show up differently as well. And one of the data points that we found, right, like I had mentioned, that idea that if men think other men are more misogynistic than they are, well, actually, in that case, then men will be less likely to speak up and challenge.
Yeah.
And if we create an intentional structure where we bring people with different attitudes and mindsets about these things into a space and create a structured dialogue around that, then we can have maybe some people that are less likely to, and some people that are more likely to, actually speaking to different contexts. And John had referenced one of the focus groups where, you know, there's this aha moment, like, until I had a chance to listen to the experiences of other people in this group, I didn't really know this was an issue. And if you don't really know it, if you're not aware, as Angela's mentioned, you're less likely to actually engage and do something about it. So, I mean, there's a couple of things here, right? This thinking differently, creating structured dialogue, and bringing people with different perspectives into a space to actually engage in deeper discussion on these issues.
Yeah, thanks for that. Just a couple of announcements, and then I want to switch to Angela again. If you post about this, please use hashtag What's Up With Men, so our colleagues can follow on social. And the other point is we will open up for questions later on, but if you have questions, you can go ahead and put those in the Q&A. I see someone already has. Thanks for that. I want to switch now to Angela. Angela, you've been leading diversity and inclusion efforts across the suite of many brands that L'Oreal represents in the US, in a very diverse workforce, diverse across kinds of professionals and different kinds of workplaces. So would love, any reflections you have on your best practices on some of this. And I know that you've also been doing some work about bringing men into the conversations. Would love your reflections on what's possible, what works, challenges that you've encountered.
Yeah, thank you very much for that, Gary. I have to tell you, there's so much about this research that resonated with the work that we do every day within L'Oreal across North America, because I do have the responsibility for the US and Canada. And I think one of the most important aspects is a point that was just raised about this need to create a space where dialogue can happen within the community of those who identify as male, and then within the greater community around whatever areas of equity that you're uncovering. But I just found it extremely powerful that whenever you can get people in a room having a dialogue on a topic, the diversity of thought is really what drives the change that we experience. And we saw that firsthand within L'Oreal. And again, I know some of you may know L'Oreal as a company and others may not, but we are a conglomerate of a number of brands, right? Each running their own separate business, but in an industry of beauty that is dominated by women as consumers primarily. But over the years, we're the underrepresented group in terms of leadership. But that has changed because there was this level of awareness that says, you know, we're in a business that is focused primarily on inspiring the best of beauty for all, but most directly speaking to women. And in order to expand our business, so this whole notion that there's a business impact to our ability to be inclusive allowed us to really look at where we had the biggest opportunities. And we had opportunities certainly to get more women in leadership, because across the beauty industry, most of those big businesses are run by men. So while the leadership at the top was very much male dominated and the majority of the population and consumer populations were female, we saw that we had some gaps through that awareness. So we audited our overall workforce and saw that we really needed to do this process of awakening to what the insights were telling us. And that is, if we really want to be an inclusive beauty company, we have to make sure that we have that representation at the top. So it took our CEO to say, we've got to change the way we work. Male-led, I might add, white French male-led. I'll add those additional dimensions. And so through that, we saw that not only did we have an opportunity to advance women and have conversation with those male leaders who were leading teams that included women, but it was to really understand how we were showing up as a company to those in the workplace. Looking for where bias was seeping in, looking where microaggressions, sometimes in the language that we use, the tone, the references. But we also had an opportunity that because the majority of our workforce was female, we didn't have a very strong succession of men coming into the organization to someday bring more equity to our leadership. So specifically within the US, we decided we were going to talk to men. What's up with men? Was really, our position. And I don't know, it was almost 6 years ago, we surveyed over 1,000 men in the company and asked them what was their experience as a male working in the beauty industry and specifically working at L'Oreal. And what was really interesting is that they were starting to see some of the same patterns that women have seen in the workplace for years, being underrepresented. Right. And because they were underrepresented on many of our teams that were led by women, or they were the only male identifying person on the team, they were starting to feel a little bit less included. Right. Their sense of belonging was a little bit less. And at the same time, they had a need to come together as men and talk about that experience, just as many women have done and other identities have done, to really start to find a place for themselves. But at the same time, draw on this level of empathy that we have been saying is one of the keys to driving really inclusive leadership for the future. So, to put it all in a nutshell, it's really about finding and creating space for people to have a dialogue, like we're doing today, really, on topics that matter. And in so doing, you ultimately build that trust where being able to speak up on things that matter becomes less of a burden and more of an insight. Yeah. So I'll pause there just in case you have some other questions you want to ask.
Izzo, yeah, I will come back. I think the kind of creating safe space for men to talk about this issue certainly is an educational practice that we try to do, whether schools and after school programming, et cetera. And then the importance of what happens in those groups in terms of is there a mixture of accountability there, as well as helping men find their self-interest in healthier masculinities. I think those are the two pieces of that stew that we tried to bring in when we do those kinds of spaces. But I was curious to, I think for some workplaces that feels strange to say men need a space to talk about, whether that's a L'Oreal specific issue, but I'd love just to hear you comment on what have the topics been that men brought up, and how have others in your workplace responded to those topics? Because that's a different order often that such conversations and employee resource groups have started.
Well, one of the points that Nicky raised was that there was a commonality among some of the experiences that all of the men had. So it wasn't just about the fact of race or ability or military status or any of those. It was just the fact that as a male in the workplace, there was this sense of not feeling like they belonged, right? So when we created our, what we call think tank at L'Oreal, they're more like employee-led resource groups elsewhere. It's usually because we saw an opportunity and we want to bring communities together to think and ideate and draw solutions, right? So our Men at L'Oreal think tank, if you will, is very general to men. It's not about Black men or those identifying as Hispanic or Asian. It's about men because men were the underrepresented group within our workforce. So bringing them together gave them that sense of belonging in itself, right? Because it was a space where they could come together and talk beyond their other dimensions of diversity. And through that, their intersectionality came out where they even found, in some cases, more commonality. But at the same time, again, I think I mentioned this earlier, the sensitivity to what it means to be underrepresented. I think, John, you talked about the privilege of being, right? So the privilege of being a male was still there. It's slightly different based upon race, right? But the privilege of being a male was finally confronted, where in this environment where they didn't feel as they were the majority, allowed them to come together and say, what do we need to do differently? So not just as men, but as allies.
Yeah.
And so within our organization, we've been able to do many more things collectively across gender identities, including LGBTQIA,
Yeah.
because we have a commonality around how do we make this a best workplace for all, where all of these different insights can come together for the common good. So I just appreciate the fact that we looked at them as a collective of men, and through that, their separate identities helped to drive a strategy to allow more equity and more inclusion across the workplace, and to be able to see what it means to be a woman in the workplace after so many years of being women being underrepresented. The men started to have that sense of understanding that we didn't have before. So,
Gary, if I can piggyback
clear
on
on that?
things
Okay.
Yeah, thank you for sharing
Angela
that.
has said,
Angela.
and I love Angela that you did that. You went out and you said, let's hear from the men. One of the things that, 4 things come to mind for me. The first thing is to recognize that men are on their own journey around this more diverse and inclusive workplace. So they're not just, guests making cameo appearance in the journey of women. And I mean that in no negative way. I just mean we have to understand men are on their own journey, right? And yet we know men need to listen. And that's true. And we have certainly found that in our work in organizations, is that when people get to hear the experiences of others who are different than them, whether it's at West Point where we work with athletes and the white players for the first time heard the experiences of systemic racism day to day that their Black teammates experienced outside of sport, and it's like scales fell from their eyes. Or in one of our focus groups, when a few of those men who were in backlash, who said, look, these movements are toxic and this stuff has been over exaggerated. And then when a woman in the focus group who had agreed with them that these movements had some negative implications said, but let me tell you what I have experienced in my 30 years in the workplace as a woman. And the men were now deeply listening. And we need that. The other piece, though, is men also need to talk. And any man listening to this knows that men talk differently when women are in the room. Just like women talk differently when men are in the room. And men rarely have an opportunity to talk in structured dialogues about their own experiences of inclusion, their challenges, their own experience of privilege, their own experiences of exclusion, their experiences trying to challenge male behavior. So one of my favorite moments in the focus groups, for example, was when a young leader who really had demonstrated that he believed these movements had a positive impact and that he was aligned around we need to make more progress with equity. And then when the question came up about whether misogynistic behavior has kind of disappeared or gone more underground, he's always gone underground. And then we said, so what do you do when it happens? And he said, well, it goes on for a while and then some guy will say, hey, maybe we're taking this too far. And then he said something I'll never forget. He said, but you don't want to be that guy. And back to Nicky's point earlier, there's a real consequence that men believe other men are more misogynistic than they are.
Yeah.
Because that means that when inappropriate things happen, instead of speaking up and challenging, I figure I'm the only one, I'm going to be quiet. Yeah. So I'll give you an example, one more thing. We do a lot of work inside organizations of bringing men together to talk before they're in conversation with others. And there's a lot of research to support that getting a privileged group to work with themselves first makes them more open to a conversation with others in the room. So at Heineken Mexico, very male, misogynistic culture, we had the men have groups first. And a lot of authentic dialogue about what it's like to be in a more diverse environment, more and more women and more female leaders, and having to challenge each other, et cetera. And they could have really open conversations with each other that they were not having in a structured way. And so we always say men talk all the time, but they don't talk about this kind of stuff. unless you get them in a structured dialogue. And when you do, profound change can happen. So it's not that, poor men, it's if we want men to change, we need them to be able to have these authentic dialogues with each other and to challenge each other. Because back to just this bell curve, if 13% of men are in backlash and then a certain percentage are kind of in here and here, we need these men to be in groups with these men and to have authentic dialogue and learn from each other, as well as having the opportunity to listen to others who have perhaps not been experienced privilege historically. So I just think we need to respect the need for men to talk to each other. There's an old saying in the learning business, the person doing the most talking is doing the most learning. Because when you're talking, you're actually having to be in the conversation, not passive.
I'll just add one more thing to that. I think, we have to understand that when we bring different voices to the table, that there will likely be differences of opinion. And so how do we raise that without there being animosity or anger? And, so how do we create that safety, trust, and opportunity for people to actually raise their differences of opinions without, and I think that speaks to the backlash piece, right? Without there being backlash, let's talk about that. Let's understand that we came from a history that maybe wasn't so great. And if we're trying to create a different kind of future, we have to acknowledge where we've come from. We have to acknowledge that there was harm and there may be animosity that comes, there may be differences of opinion that come up, but how do we actually engage in conversation without just getting angry with each other and there being that negative discord?
Yeah. I mean, it brings up to me a couple of points and reflections of some of the work that we at Promundo have tried to do. I mean, one is just if it's the learning curve or the art of accountability that I think we need to learn of, how can there be both spaces where, I mean, John, I would agree that talking can be learning, but also if talking is simply repeating what men think is the safe stuff to say, can be a lot of, just defensiveness or doing anything to avoid the deeper topics at hand. So I think finding what in a given workplace, and I appreciate, Angela, your reflections on this, of what's appropriate moments where, diverse groups are together talking about uncomfortable things.
Mm-hmm.
One of the most powerful pieces that we've used, one of our partner organizations in Chicago that actually calls their manual "What's Up with Men," uses an activity in schools where girls write down an experience of harassment or unjust treatment that they've perceived from boys. Those are passed without names on them for boys to read in discussion sessions with the girls, to think about it, to listen, and in talking in the words that what girls have faced, to basically, force them to be in a moment of putting themselves in her shoes. And then there's other spaces provided, in those kinds of discussion sessions where young men talk about their own experiences with bullying or homophobic violence, to understand, how these things are connected. And a lot of the things that you were talking about, I was thinking about some of our efforts now to try to take these conversations to younger ages. Because boys, men don't learn controlling behaviors, assuming, unquestioned privilege, believing that there's a piece of entitlement that they get coming to the workplace. This is stuff that we learn as boys, and we learn from childhood going on. And what we see a huge amount in listening to boys and listening to boys' parents is how much boys also don't feel like they can question the bullying behaviors that they see from other boys or that they experience. Some of our research finding that 40% of boys have experienced some kind of homophobic violence. About 12% define themselves as gay, but yet about 40% say they've received some kind of homophobic bullying, which in some ways is a antecedent to the kinds of harassment that men may use later in the workplace. So, and that sense of being policed. So the sense that, and what you talked about so thoughtfully in the study as well, of if we think other men hold more misogynistic views. And I think a lot of boys think that other boys think bullying is okay, but actually the vast majority are pretty upset by it. But that wall of silence that surrounds them to say, because I'm afraid what will happen if I call it out. And I guess maybe that echoes a little bit of you don't want to be that guy. Just have the bravery it takes for one or two to speak up. So, that makes me both, your data coincides a lot with what we see in boys' experiences growing up. That's both an opportunity for us to think, how do we start earlier? And it's also just gives us a sense of how much energy we spend in schools and at home and peer groups and the workplace to reinforce these harmful views around masculinities. I didn't want to end on such a pessimistic note there, but I did want to open up to some questions, and one of them being, how do we start accountability for safe places? And that's school and after school programming and the peer groups that boys and girls and non-binary individuals live in, so that we're thinking the workplace and beyond. On that, I'm just taking a glance at time, and there's 3 questions in the box here, and actually a 4th in the chat. So I wanted to make sure that we had time to go into those. I think I'm just going to read them and then ask among you, grab one that you would like to comment on, and we can, and other, you can comment on more than one if you want to. One, a really important question about what's the impact of capitalism on men's attitudes on inclusion and equity. So to think about the big structures that are behind this, and how patriarchy and capitalism sit and live side by side. So would love whoever would like to comment on that. And then a colleague asking, coming from an independent, self-sufficient woman in corporate field, personally, I feel that men are confused. They don't know how to act, how to be inclusive enough, what is acceptable. And then the question is, it isn't wrong to acknowledge differences, but how without being accused or not being evolved? How can men live in these confusing moments? Any reflections you have about that? And then a third question around what do you all think about mandatory trainings and sessions for men in the workplace versus having them be voluntary? Pros and cons of making this obligatory. And from the chat, there's sorry, pulling up a couple of questions there. Sorry, there's several. Sorry, I'm gonna scroll through here. Great, the fear of speaking out, and someone saying, in my experience, this is a skill or a muscle that needs to get learned. So I think, I'm not sure if anybody would like to talk about that. And this individual saying, and I've been consistently surprised and impressed with the positive responses I've gotten from other men when I have spoken out, if anyone wants to comment on that. And then there's another comment in there, and I will stop there. We'll do a round there. Is the importance of creating, just reinforcing, the importance of safe spaces. So I'm gonna, that was, I think, 5 questions. Probably should have broken those in 2, but I'm gonna let you jump in on ones that you'd like to.
Gary, I'll take a few. Can you hear me still?
Yeah, your sound's breaking up a little bit, but I think you're good. Yeah.
Okay.
That's better. What you just did made it.
Okay, great. Well, I want to talk about the fear of speaking up, most specifically from a workplace perspective, is that it starts with the culture that you have within the company. And it's important to establish the importance of speaking up, right? And so the way you can stand behind that is to create those environments that allow that kind of dialogue to happen. And I know not only at L'Oreal, a number of companies in the last 2 years with all of the disruption, Black Lives Matters, AAPI hate, anti-Semitism, a lot of companies started to create these safe spaces. We call them listening circles within L'Oreal, where we define a time and a topic and allow the company to come together and speak on these topics. But it's so important to establish the rules of engagement. I think, Nicky, you had referred to this earlier. When you have these dialogues, you are going to have differing opinions.
Yeah.
And that's okay, as long as you do it respectfully, right? You follow certain rules of engagement, but you learn by listening. So I like to say we listen to learn, but by creating these safe spaces, sometimes facilitated, oftentimes should be facilitated by someone who knows how to mediate these kinds of dialogues, allows people to have that comfort in being able to speak up and share, where they are. And sometimes they may need to be smaller spaces first to get people comfortable in that environment, and then be able to increase the volume of participants who need to learn from those experiences. But by all means, it starts, in my opinion, with having a culture that speaks to the importance and the value and the respect that we put on one's ability to speak up on things that matter.
Yeah.
So I'll hold off at least on that one in case someone else has a point of view. I can come back to some of the other topics as well as needed.
I just have one quick point to add to that. I think the shift that we're seeing is away from this, I think it's been termed the contest culture, right? So competition, all these kinds of things that speaks to that sort of capitalism aspect of workplaces. And what we found in the study, and you know, even like Angela, you're demonstrating that L'Oreal is doing, is we're shifting away from that. Right, we're at least intentionally trying to design workplaces to be away from that. So how are we incentivizing it? How are leaders, you know, bringing in topics of inclusion into their vision of the organization, and how is that both top down and bottom up? And I think one of the questions is sort of asked about mandatory trainings and things like that. And I think you raised an important point, is that, you know, these sort of one-shot bias or blame-based trainings aren't really effective. The ones that are effective are the ones that create space for dialogue and conversation, and like you said, that have rules of engagement. So, you know, whether mandatory or not, I think the way that these are designed will play an important role on even, you know, as an employee, my willingness to participate in them. And I think the story that is told after, one of the things that we find in our work is that the you know, for example, we do a lot of work with firefighters, and it's the firefighters that have gone through the program that go back to tell other firefighters, hey, you need to do this, it's going to change your life. And it's that storytelling, I think, that's important, and we can't lose sight of that, because if we're only focusing on the bad and never on the good, then we'll never get more buy-in or engagement from others to participate. So yeah, I think those would be a couple of points just to add on that, on the points that Angela made.
Yeah.
So great points. I'll piggyback on some things you guys said, but not duplicate. So amen to everything you said. On the fear of speaking out, one of the things I always tell people is the first and most, first of all, it is a skill, and it is hard to speak against the grain. So we should train people to be able to speak out effectively. And two of the most powerful things are, first, just to break the silence. You know, I don't really agree with that. I am not comfortable with that. I think that is not appropriate. That's to break the silence. The second thing is ask a question instead of a statement. I wonder if you think that it's productive for us to do that. I wonder if you think this is our best self showing up right here, right? The second thing around capitalism, no doubt about it. That's why, look at the mess we're in the world right now. It's not just about men. It's about a whole masculine paradigm that's associated with men, but isn't exclusive to men. And the whole mess we're in the world right now, whether it's a lack of sustainability around the environment or the wars that are going on. You know, in our work with athletes and young boys, we talk about consent isn't just about sexuality. Look at the non-consensual relationship we have with the entire earth, where without the permission or consent of, you know, the rest of the ecosystem, we pretty much doom them to death without a thought, right? For our own selfish needs. So it's actually a deep paradigm change we need. As far as mandatory training, I think they do need to be mandatory. Here's why. Because we need people to show up. But as Nicky said, look at our study, you'll see what I call the inverted pyramid, which is the more, especially among men, the more trainings are positioned as, we're going to teach you that you're biased, we're going to teach you that you need to be more inclusive, versus we're going to give you an opportunity to learn from each other, to explore, that there's an openness that people have when they're positioned that way. So what I would say is, think about how you position your work, and how much of the time are people listening and talking versus listening to each other and talking about their experiences, as you said, Gary, of exclusion, One of the most powerful things we find with men, and you talked about this, is when men become aware of their own experiences of exclusion, which leads to more empathy for those who may experience a form of exclusion they have not. And the more we're just teaching people about bias or about inclusion, the less effective it is. The more we're opening up a space for learning, I think the more effective those mandatory trainings will be. And they don't have to be mandatory, but ultimately, if you want everybody at the table, it is a statement that this is important.
Yeah.
So, at least they should be voluntory.
Yeah. Go ahead, Angela. Yes.
I don't know if you caught this before, but in addition to that, on the mandatory training aspect, it needs to be consistent and fed throughout the overall communication strategy that you have for your business. So it's one thing to train somebody on unconscious bias. It's another thing to continue to remind them of how it shows up in the workplace and why it matters to your business and to your population. So I just wanted to add that other aspect of consistent messaging. One and done doesn't work. So it's okay to check the box and say, okay, yeah, my people were trained, our teams were trained on unconscious bias. It's another thing to live it and look for ways to find it and how it shows up in the workplace.
Yeah, I agree with that. I actually just the other day had a message from a friend of mine that said, I just had to sit through a racism training that didn't address anything whatsoever. And she's a woman of color. And I mean, I think speaking from her lived experience, if that's the kind of response you're getting from your training, you need to reconsider how they're being put out there. What's the outcome and goal of them?
Yeah. I was just going to comment on the colleague who asked, kind of how can we think about this within a capitalist system is around what are the intentions for corporations and businesses coming to the table? I feel a degree of discomfort many times. I mean, we could go backward and big discomforts about the inequality, of course, but often corporations saying, we do this because it's good for the bottom line.
Yeah.
So we, kind of mix in a little bit of training because, this stuff is a trouble for us. It's getting in the way of our profits versus are we holding workplaces accountable, including for-profit ones, to a sense that every human has inherent worth and rights are rights. They don't need a bottom line to be proven that every worker deserves dignity and equality. So I think partly we've got to think about what are we doing as civil society thought leadership and allies like you, Angela, within a workplace to say, this stuff harms the bottom line, but we're here because of the inherent worth and dignity and equality that all individuals need. And I think if we center the conversations that way, they become much more, that's where the conversations really start to get to where they should take us toward conversations about what are some of the systemic drivers of this. And even pragmatically where they're important. We were in a conversation with some colleagues with the Biden administration who are working on a campaign about reducing sexual harassment and getting more women truck drivers. And they realized, and in the conversations with them to say, how can you talk about bringing men, it's a majority men industry, on board with this, if we don't question the very extractivist practices of how they are treated as male drivers? Cameras watching every move. They're made to take the risk of if their trucks are, if they're delayed, their pay is what gets docked, everything, all the risks push onto them. And they're made to drive more and more hours, et cetera. That kind of, if we don't look at their fundamental rights as workers, bringing them along as allies for gender equality is really difficult and maybe questionable at lots of different levels. So I give those as examples. I think our role, as civil society has got to be to ask those difficult questions. And really appreciate, Angela, that in the chances we've had to interact in the work at L'Oreal, that I think that sense that you are believing in your workers as having that inherent dignity, it shines through. It's important that you, as a senior VP, are able to have that shine through, because otherwise, I think we can bring in diversity training as a little bit of window dressing. So let me. I know that we've got a couple of minutes left, and I wanted to give John and Nicky, as the co-authors of the study, any final reflections. So Angela, why don't I offer you first any final reflections you have, and then turn over to John and Nicky to close us out.
Yeah, thank you for that. I'll play off of the one question that was asked about why men are confused and how do they engage without being accused. And it starts again with creating a space that says it's okay, right? Because we don't know what we don't know. We're all guilty and vulnerable on so many topics as it relates to diversity, equity, and inclusion, that we have to admit, first of all, that we don't know everything. And so to be able to create a space where people can have a dialogue respectfully, safely, bravely, is really where the change begins. So I said this earlier, the ability to listen to learn is at the core, and allowing that type of conversation to happen is ultimately not only going to drive the workplace productivity to the point you raised, we're impacting our communities, we're impacting our civilization. And it isn't just about gender and race and ability anymore, it's about the way we live and work. So I, again, want to appreciate and very much appreciate the work that Promundo does every day. As a mother of a 13-year-old boy, I'm very much engaged in the listening to learn, and for the research that Blueprint has done that really starts to take a topic that so many people kind of push to the side about what men's roles are, and knowing that they are very much active and interested in being a part of this dialogue. So thank you very much for that, and for creating the space to allow us to share our story today.
Thank you, Angela. A couple of quick things, please. People asked about the link. The link to the study is in the chat for the US and Canada. Read it. There are a lot of great gems in there. Want to echo thank you, Angela, for your great work at L'Oreal. Thank you, Gary, for your team's great work at Promundo. Someone said in the chat, male leaders, especially the senior executives, often don't go to the trainings. Well, just literally when this is over, Nicky and I will be doing a 2-hour session with the top people, the second most top people of one of the largest banks in the world. We insisted first the top team went through it, and then the rest of the leadership team will go through it, 3,000 people, and the executives have to sit in residence in another program. So they'll literally have been through it 3 times. So you should insist that the senior leaders go through it. Finally, there's so much good news in this study. I believe we're making progress. That's the good news. And by the way, all genders said, we're not there yet. We've got a ways yet to go. I consider that a very important fact. And finally, there is a significant amount of people who really are uncomfortable. And we need to give them a chance to be in the dialogue in a structured way. Because unless we allow those fears and objections to be voiced, then I don't think we're ever going to bring together to a different place. So anyway, Nicky, over to you for the final word.
Thanks, John. I'll echo a sincere thanks to have this opportunity to talk about this important issue. The only thing I'll add really is that there's this topic of intersectionality that's being thrown around. And I think what that speaks to is that we all have different layers to ourselves beyond just the visible, that speaks to shared experiences. So, and I'll give one example. One of my male white colleagues, grew up poor and was the first to go to university. And I was one of the first to go to university in my family. And when he was sharing with me, he felt out of place and sort of made fun of, didn't really know, the language or the terminology. That was exactly how I felt when I first went to university. And until he shared that with me, I would have never thought that this privileged white man had the same experience as me. So I don't think that this conversation is only for, people that have been traditionally marginalized. I think it's an everyone issue, because as we've mentioned, we've all had some experiences of exclusion. And so the intent to participate in training or have these conversations, it's not only going to benefit one set of people, it's going to benefit us all. And it's just, I don't know, create a better world at the end of the day. That might be a little lofty, but if we don't start here, then I don't really know how far we can get. And unless we start to see each other as humans and human beings with shared experiences, we won't have the kind of change that we really want.
That seems like the great perfect note to end on, Nicky. Thank you very much for that. And congratulations to Blueprint on the study. More conversations to be had. Thanks to our colleagues at Ladbury PR for all the support behind the scenes and supporting getting the message out. Thanks much. Please do consult the study. There's the link there. And yeah, look forward to staying in touch.
Yes, thank you so much.
Thank you, Gary, for hosting. We appreciate it.
Thank you all.
I know.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.